Three, two. Hey everyone, welcome back to Earth Station One. That's right, folks. It is time now to talk about the main topic, and we are going a whole 40 years into the future to the world of the Jetsons. That's right, folks. We are looking at the 60th anniversary of the Jetsons, and folks, let's get our conveyor belts and hop on it, and let's go travel the world and go see where we're going to go. And then we'll hop into our flying cars and go up to Earth Station 1 and see what Mikey has to talk about tonight. Ready?
Yeah, we're talking all about the Jetsons. Meet George Jetson, right? Jane, his wife, and we all know the song. We got a great crew to talk all about it right from Toontown. We've got our two Marks with us. Mark Heffernan is here.
Hello, everybody. Good to be here. I think
And
this is the first time on video Earth Station One.
yeah, well, it's like the Jetsons, right? Like the video calls, right? They didn't just do audio then, right? So
Yep.
we are just one of the things that the Jetsons sort of predicted would be the case, right? And Mark McRae is here.
Hey everybody, nice to be here, and it's been a while since I spoke to you guys, and it's a great topic, so I'm ready to go.
Well, we were a little late last year, I think, because early last year we talked about the anniversary of the Flintstones, and I think that's a great way. I mean, you can't talk about the Jetsons, I don't think, start talking about them anyway without talking about the Flintstones, because it seems to me it was the success of the Flintstones from Hanna-Barbera that they said, okay, what's next? And they said, well, let's do a family drama, or family sitcom, but let's put it way in the future instead of way in the past. And so we get the Jetsons, and that's how roughly how it's born. But you guys can tell me a little bit more about that. Before we get into the details there, do you guys remember, Mark Heffernan, do you remember like your first experience watching the Jetsons?
Well, I wasn't born in 1962, so
Right.
I caught it on syndication. By the time I was watching the shows, it was basically on syndication because it had already left the networks on Saturday morning. So it was like it was on I can't remember the year, but it was on channel 44 out in San Francisco. And that's where you'd watch it. Is either on channel 44 would either show it on Sunday mornings or during the week, depending on. I think they mostly showed it on Sunday mornings because for a long time there was just 24 episodes, so showing it on Sunday mornings meant they could stretch it out a bit longer. And
Yeah. It's interesting because that first season, it aired from 1962 to 1963, and it only lasted that one season on prime time in the 60s. If everything else was syndication, new episodes were produced in the 80s. We'll get into all that, but I think I caught it around that time too, the early 80s, late 70s, as well, syndication for sure. Because yes, I was not around in 62 to 63 either. I wasn't even a thought at that time. Like, that was not even close. So but Mark, what about you? Do you recall your first experience with the Family of the Future?
I don't. I feel like I saw it either on CBS's Saturday morning or NBC Saturday morning, but I knew that it was not a new show. I knew that it at least had been around. And the episode that kind of comes to mind, I do remember the first episode that I remember. It's the episode where one of Elroy's classmates, he's watching like the millionth episode repeat of a Flintstones episode on his handy, I guess it would be a smartwatch now, right? And he's watching the actual episode. And so that kind of connected the Jetsons and the Flintstones for me. I said, okay, same production company. But I knew that the Jetsons, as well as Johnny Quest, which was another one, they sort of bounced around on Saturday mornings, but I knew for whatever reason that they weren't new programming, but I still watched it and liked it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I got that impression too. I mean, I can't recall the first time I ever watched the Jetsons. So the first episode I ever saw, I can't even remember, like, yeah, very much a lot of episodes, to be honest with you. But it wasn't for lack of enjoying it. I remember watching it a lot. But I think it's just my old brain not being able to tap into some of that stuff. But I did recall that it wasn't, in fact, until, you know, we did the research, I didn't even know they produced new ones in the 80s. So, but I think I watched it. I do remember that it was something that was only on like once a week. It wasn't on, like, the Flintstones was on like every day to compare it to. And I don't want to spend all the whole episode comparing the two, but the Flintstones and there was other cartoons and stuff that was on every day, but the Jetsons was on once a week, and I do remember that as well. Mike, what about you? What's your earliest memories of the Jetsons?
Well, for me, it was after school or later, earlier. Of course, it was probably pre-K or whatever, and nursery school. I remember watching it on Channel 5 in Washington D.C. It was on every afternoon. And being able to see it then, and it was fun as heck being able to watch it, because like you, I was not even a gleam in my parents' eye in 1962. And I think 1962 was the year my parents graduated high school. So it was, so they were, so they weren't even thinking about Little Mike or whatever they wanted to. So it was interesting though, but I remember watching it and being fascinated by the flying cars and being flyed by all the neat technology and everything, and was fascinated by it. And, I guess it was already at the time getting into sci-fi and early geekdom, as we like to say, but I was fascinated by it. And I remember the episode I saw was when George and, what was I think his name was George, was I think George Jetson and his handyman were drafted. Henry were drafted into the army. Was the first one that I saw.
Wow,
that's a good one.
And that's why it stood out to me, because I remember, these guys are going into the army and they're going to be soldiers and everything. And, it wasn't anything like that. It was really cute and everything. And he was like, wow, he's old. And he could get drafted? That's awesome. So it was a neat episode, and I just went from there, and because I don't think they showed him in any kind of order or anything either.
Yeah, probably not in syndication. Plus, I mean, if you were watching it in a market that they were showing it every day,
right?
If that was when they only had the 20-some episodes, man, you probably saw like a lot of those a lot. like that's a heavy repeat.
But that was
every month pretty much is like, we're going to see the same ones over again every month.
But it was interesting too, because I never realized until I was in college, when I started studying animation and in the history of animation and such, that they only had done one season at that point. And then the 80s thing, because it felt like there were a zillion different episodes, but there were only a handful, and that's how much meaning they had to me, because I thought there was just so much more, and I got so much out of each episode, everything. And
well, the TV model back in those days, I mean, some first seasons have 38 episodes back in the 60s, because they used to try to produce, have fresh episodes almost for the entire year. And as television expenses, went up in production, networks started scaling back. But like, if you look at a lot of shows from the 1960s, even ones like the Jetsons that only ran one season, they can have upwards to 27 to 38 episodes, and which is just kind of outrageous, and this was before networks came up with May sweeps, where everything came to an end and a network was declared the winner. Like, they would actually try to program almost through the summer. And I mean, it probably meant great employment for actors and people in production, but you didn't get much of a vacation back in those days, nor could you like go and do a movie on the side. But that was how television was back then.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, we had talked to Stanley a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about My Three Sons and how Fred McMurray a lot of times used to film all his scenes for the whole season all at once. And so that way he could go off and do movies and everything. Mm-hmm. And everyone filmed around his schedule.
Yeah.
That was a special arrangement, though, because even at that time, there was still like this pretty big divide between TV actors and movie actors. I mean, there wasn't a lot of crossover, and usually it was the case of a movie actor, once they went to TV, they didn't go back to movies very often. Like,
right. Henry Fonda had a Western. I think it lasted 2 seasons, and I had never heard of it. Where I'm working at now, Scripps Television, it was one of the shows I had to watch, and I'm like, Henry Fonda did a TV Western? Like, what? And I looked up information on the series, and he sort of had a similar arrangement like Fred McMurray, where he shot all of his stuff ahead of time, and he would go off and do movies, because both of these guys were still in demand as movie actors. And I just think it was really progressive that they found a way to kind of work around the system.
Mm-hmm.
That explains why Astro was only in a couple of the episodes then for the Jetsons.
I love Astro.
Well, what was a friend of mine used to say, when we were on one of our benders in college, it's Mike, that Astro was the prototype for Scooby-Doo. And it's like, okay.
Yeah.
And now when you look at it, though, it's kind of right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Ruh-roh, right? Right, George? It's like, damn, he's right.
Mm-hmm. So as I said, yes. So the Flintstones comes out in 1960. Critically, as we've talked about before, not really well received, but the public loved it. So they kept making more. And Hanna-Barbera obviously wanted to do more of this. So I don't know if the Jetsons was there, and you guys probably know this more than I would, but if this was their second attempt at primetime cartooning, but obviously they used the model of a sitcom and a family sitcom to come out in 1962 with hopefully the same result. And do you guys know any more about what went into sort of the origins of the Jetsons, at least in this stage?
Well, I can tell you that the Jetsons premiered on Sunday at 7 p.m. in 1962, opposite The Wonderful World of Disney, which was basically the reason it didn't really become super popular in prime time, because parents would turn on Disney, right. And that really hurt the Jetsons. Interestingly, even though the Flintstones were all made in color, the first couple of seasons aired in black and white. Mm-hmm. The Jetsons was the first series by ABC to actually air in color, despite the fact that most people still had just black and white TVs at the time. So they actually aired it in color, probably as a stunt to, but the problem is Wonderful World of Disney, if you had a color TV, was also airing in color. Right. So, and like I said, I think airing opposite Wonderful World of Disney was just basically the death knell. Although oddly enough, when it moved to the Saturday mornings, it did really well, which always made me wonder, why didn't they make more episodes in the 60s now that it was on Saturday morning and it was actually getting a pretty good audience.
Interesting.
I think part of another reason it didn't work out as well in primetime is because it was a family sitcom. It made more sense for it to air on Saturday mornings. The Flintstones, at least at first, was not a family sitcom. It was two groups of friends. and I think it had more appeal to adult viewers. It was basically like the Honeymooners.
Well, exactly. That's what it was based off of.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
I think adults could get more out of the Flintstones than they could the more family vibe Jetsons. So that's just my thoughts. I
No,
mean,
absolutely. I think also to piggyback on that too, on the other network, you had Dennis the Menace airing at the same time. So, and that we all know the popularity of that show because that show lasted 6 years. So, look, if you're a family and you're gonna watch, if you're not gonna watch Walt Disney, you're gonna watch Dennis the Menace. It seems like the Jetsons would be like a third choice, which is unfortunate, uh, but why they didn't move it to another night, or like you said, Mike, why didn't they move it to another, like just to have it on in the morning? I don't know why that decision wasn't made to continue it on, but Mark, do you have any insights as to the origin of the series first and foremost, or and then when it was broadcast?
I, what I know is that during the research phase of the Jetsons, that the animators and the writers, they heavily researched what type of technology might be available in the next 30 or 40 years, like from 1961 or 1962. So I know that they definitely tried to add in elements of real technology or what they thought real technology might exist in the future or the timeline that the Jetsons are supposed to exist in. The other thing is the Jetsons wasn't exactly a failure because back in those days they gave shows like 13 weeks to prove themselves. And the fact that the Jetsons got past the first 13 weeks, gave ABC the confidence, like, well, maybe this show has legs. But probably by the time it got to the end of the season, it was probably, not doing that great. And then it got shipped to Saturday morning. And that's part of how Saturday morning became a thing, because shows like the Jetsons and Top Cat and the Bugs Bunny show, which didn't do great in prime time, Alvin and the Chipmunks was another one. All these shows started out in prime time, and because of contractual reasons or whatever, they were moved to Saturday morning. And like Mark said, all of a sudden they're doing great there. That became where sort of rejected primetime shows ended up, but eventually Saturday morning became a real thing where you had the networks actually wanting to produce, new programming for the block. But at the time, it was either a contract had to be fulfilled and space also had to be fulfilled. And Saturday morning, I mean, in terms of ratings and everything, like a show like the Jetsons probably did really fantastic. Not to the point though where the network was like, let's make some new
Spend
episodes.
A lot of money.
Right. Because that wasn't a thing to make something new specifically for Saturday morning. I mean, that would come later. I think with Secret Squirrel and Adam Ant becoming the first being specifically made for the Saturday morning audience, and maybe the Beatles cartoon, but it just wasn't a business yet.
Yeah, because I could see that too. It's like from a business, you have 26 episodes, right? So for every Saturday, that's half a year's worth of programming that you don't have to worry about, right? That you've already paid for. So you just show it twice. Each episode airs twice a year. You do that for however many years you can. I totally understand from a business standpoint. But you also said something else pretty interesting too, is that, we tend to think of the 60s being the big space race and everybody being really into space, but this might have been a little too early for that. And to get really catch on, I think maybe with audiences, and we, other shows that we all know and love now that were in prime time, that were space oriented live action shows like Star Trek, they had a hard time getting viewers as well. Maybe the public wasn't into watching space fantasy shows. Maybe that was part of it too. I don't know if that's fair.
You know, I think it's a fair argument because Lost in Space also, you know, sort of struggled, but sometimes I blame the network for their struggles because first season Lost in Space was really serious, and then second and third season it was in color, but you also had the focus all of a sudden went to Will Robinson and the Mr. Smith characters, and some of the episodes got silly because it was going up against Batman. Because Batman was very colorful and very campy, they decided to make Lost in Space campy, which is something a network wouldn't even dream of doing these days. You know what? Our competition is doing a campy show, so we're going to make your show campy too. And, you know, Irwin Allen, who created Lost in Space, I guess, I'm sure behind the scenes, he was probably, you know, saying all kind of not nice things about what the network was doing to his show, but that was the thought. And but I think there may have been a reluctance for viewers to see something in space. I mean, I kind of feel like space shows actually worked better in the 70s and the 80s than they did in the 60s.
Well, post Star Wars, I think everything does work. Space shows post Star Wars work really well, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons that the Jetsons kind of got new life into the 80s was because space shows were now like a thing that could sell, and people who were writing them, I think, actually understood them a little bit more. Because, all right, let's talk about this a little bit, because we're talking about the space element of the show. When I watched it then, I just thought, hey, flying cars, you know, building whatever. I mean, everything was really cool. You could do stuff with a button. There was robots. It was really cool to look at visually. But it depicts, watching it now, it depicts a very strange and not exactly hopeful future. You know, I mean, on the outside, it's like you've got this like sort of quote unquote nuclear family, right? In this post-nuclear age, but it's you're like, you know, I'm wondering, like, why does everybody live up in the air? Like, what's wrong with the ground?
You never see the ground, really.
Exactly. You never see, like, and we know it's Earth because people are they talk about going to other countries. They talk about going, and tubes is the way you travel. But it seems like it's a very, like, everybody presses buttons. George Jetson only works like what, an hour, 2 days a week, like something like that. Like he's like, and he just pushes buttons, and they complain about how much work that is. It's not a very diverse like group of you know, people that we see that are up here. It just looks very, very strange looking at it with modern eyes now. What do you guys think? But it looks like the technology, a lot of it was
it comes right.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
What were you saying, Mark?
Yeah, it comes across, I know what you mean, it comes across kind of, I guess, clinical a little bit, in the sense that they have all this technology, but why aren't people having more fun? They seem to be still complaining about things that everyone in the 20th century is complaining about. But I guess that was to make it more relatable to viewers. So I get that. And, you know, like you had mentioned, Mike, about the people, you know, pressing buttons and complaining. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Jane gets Rosie the robot.
Exactly. Yeah, we watched that first.
Because her finger got like this.
Her finger started to hurt. Well, and the machine was breaking down too. I mean, to her credit, to her defense, it was like a bad machine too.
Right,
but even George gets George is at work, and all he does is press a couple buttons, a day. And he complains about how it's and he can't even do it right, apparently, according to his boss. Mark Heffernan, what do you think of the dynamic here as far as the way the future is depicted here? Is it a future that you really want to embrace, or is it something that just is like this is kind of weird?
Well, you have to remember, when you're watching the show, I think you have to remember when it was made.
Absolutely.
It really has a late 50s At least that first season in particular has a really late 50s, early 60s vibe. The mother stays home. She doesn't go to work. I mean,
She
the
spends the money. She took his wallet in the opening scene of the show.
yes. I mean, that's what she does. I mean, Judy, she's boy crazy. You know, that's basically
Oh,
mostly her
he's
character.
the dreamiest.
I mean, every time there's a story based on Judy, it's usually because she's boy crazy about somebody. And then Elroy is the smart little kid. You know, it's probably the reason why my two favorite characters in the show are Astro the dog and Rosie the robot.
Right. Yes, that's true.
Because I just think they're the most interesting characters because it's like you're watching it and it feels like you're just watching a late 50s sitcom, you know,
Right.
or an early 60s sitcom with the nuclear family. The only difference is this is a family that lives up in the air. I don't know why they live up in the air, but they do. And they have all this technology. The thing that I always wonder about watching the show is if all they're doing is pressing buttons, what about exercise? Why aren't they all super fat? I mean, all they're doing is pressing buttons. I mean, if you're just sitting at a desk or pressing buttons, or press the button to, you know, summon the robot to do the work, shouldn't you be outside exercising? But they're not even doing walking because they're on moving sidewalks.
Well, it's kind of funny you mention exercise because there is a really funny gag of George. He's supposed to be exercising and he turns on the TV and this, you know, the first exercise dude that was on television is supposed to be like a version of Jack LaLanne. Right. And Jack LaLanne is telling George to jump rope and to do X, Y, and Z. And George is basically lying in bed when all this is going on. And then after the video ends, he acts like he has done some exercising. So I said, oh, that's what exercising is in the future, you know? But one of the things I did realize about the Jetsons, you know, watching it as a kid and watching it with adult eyes, is that it's sort of hinted that George has a roving eye in some of the episodes, that he's not the most trustworthy husband. And in one of the episodes, Jane comes home from a vacation because she thinks that George is with some unnamed blonde. And so the little adult elements in there, I think, are kind of cool. And then, Mike, you had mentioned earlier about the first episode you saw with George going to the Army. That's one of two appearances of the robot Uniblab.
I know.
That shows up. First, Uniblab takes George's promotion in one episode, and then he becomes his commander in that Army episode that you referenced. And, you know, and in both times, they kind of, Uniblab is obnoxious and he sort of gets his comeuppance because he gets, they find a way to get the robot drunk. And you didn't see a lot of, you know, like any animated character getting drunk, as far as I'm concerned, has definitely gone into the adult sphere, you know, of things happening.
Right.
And it's a great episode and it's funny. It's really funny.
I could tell when I rewatched,
you know, so those little things.
Well, I could tell when I rewatched the pilot. Sorry, Mark. Just real quick. I could tell when I rewatched the pilot that there was things in here in this cartoon that were definitely aimed for adults, and that was definitely like some of the. And I know that stuff went way over my head when I was a kid watching it back in the day. But now I'm like going, wow, there's this. I mean, they're talking about this, that, and the other thing, and it's like, oh, okay. But I'm sorry, Mark. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, talking about going back to the exercise for a minute, one of the episodes that I rewatched getting ready for this was the one where Cosmo Spacely and George Jetson go to sneak out to go to the football game. And the football game's being played by robots, so they're not even getting their exercise playing football.
They don't even have human athletes.
No, the coach was even programming it, looking at something like very similar to a video game now, you know, and to make it run. It was
Actually,
just really
I
interesting.
think I think that's a good analogy that they're actually playing video games rather than actually, participating in real sports. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the one thing that the show got really good was the fact that a lot of the stuff that's in the show, except for maybe likely the flying cars, obviously, um, a lot of that stuff we've got equivalents nowadays. You
Yeah,
know,
flat screen TVs, and
Yes.
yeah, a lot of stuff can be done with a push of a button
Or
or a
look what
push
we're
of
talking
just
to
on your phone.
right now. We're talking over Zoom. They had the video calls. I mean,
Right, exactly. And even paying for cable. I mean, there's one episode where George is watching something and the television just goes dead and he has to insert a quarter to get the television to come back. And that's pay TV. You
And
know?
I think that's like that is part of the charm. And I think part of the charm when we were watching it as kids was that environment, that space age environment, more than it was because I think someone's already said about how the characters come across. Mark Heffernan, as you pointed out, there was like in the Flintstones, there's like it's about friendship. It's about like there's a real warmth there between all the characters. You don't really get that in the Jetsons. The Jetsons is they're a family onto themselves. I mean, they interact with other people, but there's no like real good friends. His work environment is not great, but as you guys pointed out, it's not one that he does a lot of physical work. I mean, this is a guy. This is like, I mean, it's sort of like the Flintstones is like lower class, and maybe the Jetsons is like middle class, like different classes of families there. I definitely see the family sitcom influence, like the My Three Sons, Leave It to Beaver, all those kind of shows that were there's one the one Rosie the Robot kind of reminds me of, what was it, Hazel, the show, the family
that's
show
what they
about the
were
maid.
trying to go
Mhm.
for.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah, it really got that vibe on it too. So you got this sort of like family dynamic there, but it didn't seem to have I mean, everything was kind of cool, but the actual family itself seemed to me a little like colder than not a lot of warmth to it than Shay. And like I said, I hate to keep comparing it, but like a show like the Flintstones or other shows like that. So to me
I,
personally,
yeah, I do think though that some of the episodes, were fun, like the Jet Screamer episode. I mean, I guess Jet Screamer was supposed to be their version of Elvis, and
right.
the song and the music is I just think it's brilliant, that particular episode. And the other episode where Jane enters the beauty contest and, she sings about, Bill Spacely, or I think it's Bill Spacely coming home. And it's a real standout performance. And, so great that they don't even bother. You don't even bother to see the other contestants because, the character, Miss Western Hemisphere or Miss Southern Hemisphere, whatever her character name is, she has just stolen the show. And I remember one year I was watching the Grammys, falling asleep on my couch, and the singer comes out. I don't know who he is, and all of a sudden I start to wake up, and I later realized it's Ricky Martin, and he gives this performance at the Grammys, and I immediately thought about that Jetsons episode, and I said, "Oh my gosh!" I said, "Ricky Martin just stole the freaking Grammy show." And for years and years and years, I always wanted to see a moment like that on live TV, and I actually got to see it because the next day it was all about Ricky Martin at the Grammy show, and I always think about the Jetsons, that cartoon, that particular episode, actually projected something happening in the future, that actually did happen on television much, much, much later. So for me, like being a cartoon fan and seeing that live moment happen, I'm just like, wow. I said, that's pretty cool. I said, Ricky Martin just stole the show, just like Jane Jetson did back in the day.
So so as we said, the show lasted a year. Then when it was in syndication in the 80s, 1985, I believe, they made new episodes. So they made a few more seasons of episodes, and they went on for a couple more years in that direction. Mostly the same cast, mostly the same characters. There were some additions. We have Orbity joining the show, which you would think would be one of those characters that would be pretty much divisive, shall we say? Like sometimes when they get these like cute little aliens or whatever on a show, it kind of like people talk about it. There's some other characters too. How do you guys feel about the 80s shows as opposed to the original run? Is there that much of a difference? Are some better than others? Or Mark Heffernan, where do you stand on that?
Well, my opinion on the 80s ones is I'm not a big fan of Orbity. I thought adding more to the Space Land was not a bad idea, like his nephew. I can't remember the name right off my head, but having his nephew show up, having more on the Spacely side kind of opened up the show a little bit. Are they as good as the original 24? No. I will tell you that Orbity was dropped in the third season except for one cameo, and he did not appear in the movie in 1990. So obviously they decided afterwards that they did not want to have that character as part of the show. So like I said, I'm not a big fan of Orbity. I think the original shows are definitely what you want to watch. But to be fair, if you go out and buy the DVD set, or if you stream it on HBO Max, they're there if you want to watch them.
Mm-hmm.
So,
oh yeah, all of the complete run of the 60s and 80s shows are right now available on HBO Max. They may change the way HBO Max is doing things, so who knows? Mark McRae, what do you feel about the differences between those seasons? I mean, 20 years passed, right? So it's that's a long time to sort of say, here's season 2. I mean, we see that now, right? Like we see a lot of things like making like comebacks and continuing on. But I mean, for a cartoon like that seems like it was kind of unusual.
Yeah. I just think that Hanna-Barbera, they were really into redoing a lot of their old properties over again for a new audience. Mike had brought up, the Flintstones meets the Jetsons, and I would have loved to have seen something like that maybe when both series were in their original runs, or at least something like that being produced in the 60s when all the original voice actors were still alive.
Which would be amazing.
Yeah, it would have been great. And I think I thought it was a missed opportunity, but because I feel like the industry was, always evolving, the animation industry, with new people coming in and new people leave and old people leaving. And I'm not a huge fan of those 80 episodes, and I agree with Mark, because they really did not need Orbity. They already had Astro. Mm-hmm. And I just think that Orbity, and I understand why they added Orbity, because that was the thing, to add a sidekick. A lot of times adding a sidekick got your animated series sold to a network, or maybe a syndicator would pick it up. We need something for the little kids, and I totally get that.
Hey, not just animation. Clash of the Titans got that metal owl, right? Like I mean, like everybody, you needed, like, the studios needed something for the kids, but also something they could sell, right? Exactly. Like a toy that they could sell, right?
Exactly. And I feel like what I will say about the 80s Jetsons is that I think it is sort of, they are trying to balance the adult, and they know that primarily more kids are going to be watching it, but in my opinion, they tried to keep some adult elements in there because they probably knew that the kids that might have grown up on the Jetsons might be watching with their kids in the 80s. and maybe keeping some of those adult elements in there might help. But to me, it was a watered down version of the original show. Although they did have some pretty cool moments. There's an episode where they do like the futuristic version of Family Feud. And I think the Jetsons are going up against the Space Leads, which is pretty cool. So it's like stuff like that, I think, help make it contemporary and bring in that new audience, but it's not the same show. And, Hanna-Barbera, unlike maybe some of the other studios, when they did a revival of one of their old properties, it just seems so, I don't know, just seems so different to the point where, wow, did this actually come from the originating studio? You kind of get that impression sometimes, because the Johnny Quest remakes also, whether they were movies or some of the shows, just never had that same feel again. Even though as a viewer, I was happy to see something new with these characters, but I don't know. It's like something was missing, I guess you can say about the Jetsons.
I think they lost out on some great like cross promotion, because you could have had, especially, I haven't seen the movie, Mike, so you might have to tell me about this if this happens, but if you got the Flintstones and the Jetsons together, I think, if they don't work in the Great Gazoo with both of those, I don't know why you're doing anything. Like that's that seems to me like a prime opportunity, because isn't he supposed to be like an alien from the future or something, right? Like,
right. And
to me, like that seems
that's right,
like
dum dum.
Exactly.
And there is an episode where the Flintstones, visit the Jetsons timeline, or a very close timeline, and to me that would have been just great for at least a cameo of the Jetsons. But then,
of course,
they, but then they would have to pay the original voice actors just to come in and do that part, and maybe the budget didn't allow that, because they did do a Yogi Bear cameo in the Flintstones, and that's cool, but the Gazoo sends the Flintstones into the future and the Jetsons are there. How awesome would have been? That would have been great, And again, a missed opportunity.
Oh,
I do know there
all
was
the way
some,
through.
Yeah, I do know there was some crossover, just a little bit, like you said, not a lot. I do know that I think in one of the wacky races, right, Elroy is kidnapped or something, and so there's stuff like that, but moreover, after 87, we get that Jetsons meet Flintstones movie. We get another movie, Rockin' with Judy Jetson. We get the Jetsons movie theatrically in 1990. A few years ago, God, now it's 5 years ago, Jetsons and the WWE with Robo WrestleMania. So the Jetsons they're still around, but they're like, it doesn't seem like they're like few and far between. I know that a live action version has been started and stopped and started and stopped. Even Robert Rodriguez was attached to one version of it at one point. I know that they've done like sort of a adult sort of version of the Jetsons in DC Comics, like they did with the Flintstones. I don't think that was as successful either. I'm not sure, but it seems like the Jetsons are always having like a tough time of it trying to get over. So I don't know. Let me ask you, and we can sort of start to wrap this up, I guess, unfortunately, but is the Jetsons something that you feel still has legs that can be done, either live action, animated, whatever, with interesting stories? Do you think it's a property that it should stay the way it is? It was best in the 60s. Any continuation has just been kind of difficult, and just leave it be. Mark Heffernan, we'll start with you. Where do you stand on the future of the Jetsons?
Well, the problem is all the original voice actors are no longer with us.
Obviously,
since gone. So you'd have to get a completely brand new cast. Also, you probably would have to do a complete reboot, because The Jetsons movie that you mentioned in 1990 was supposed to be the series. It was supposed to function as a series finale. In other words, it was supposed to
Oh,
be.
wow.
Most people didn't go see it. It came out in 1990 when Days of Thunder and Dick Tracy and Die Hard 2 were all out in the theaters, and people were going to see those. They weren't going to see the Jetsons. Plus the fact that, let's be honest, people had gotten spoiled by The Little Mermaid, which had come out 6 months earlier. So
Oh, big time.
they wanted better quality animation than what Hanna-Barbera was giving with the Jetsons movie. But I think you would have to do a complete reboot from the beginning again. I don't know if I necessarily want to see that or not. I think I'm kind of okay with what we've got. But I can imagine that Warner, which owns Hanna-Barbera, at some point will seriously consider rebooting the Jetsons. If they haven't already considered reboot, I'm surprised they haven't considered rebooting the Flintstones yet either.
Well, the Flintstones has been, we've talked about it on their show when we did that, and we did, speaking of another Hanna-Barbera property, Scooby-Doo, we've seen those things happen like year after year after year. Although, what happened to Scoob this year was not cool. So we don't know what the future has for any of these formerly Hanna-Barbera properties, now Warner Brothers owns. But Mark, what do you feel? Does the Jetsons still have a future?
No pun intended.
I intend the pun. We always intend the pun here on Earth Station.
I think that it would have to be. I think someone would have to. I would like to see a really great live action version of the Jetsons happen, but would have to be someone that really has some imagination, someone who is really a fan of the property, and someone who can interpret that old property and interpret it in a way that is being made interesting. I feel like we're sort of living in the Jetsons era right now. We don't have the flying cars, but we have everything else. So in order to make the Jetsons relevant, you would have to sort of make the technology stand out a whole lot more than what we've seen already. And I guess it would have to be like the technology would have to level up, and you would have to also make the characters interesting, and Jane would have to be interesting too. If she is at home, maybe she's working at home now, as opposed to just being, like what Mark mentioned earlier, that late 50s, early 60s family prototype that was very popular on TV. That's just not going to fly. Like the Jetsons actually literally have to be brought into the modern era in order for it to be successful. It works. The Flintstones sort of works as an evergreen brand because it's prehistoric, and so they can do whatever they want. And
I see what you mean.
But with the Jetsons, now if Warner Brothers or anyone were to bring the Jetsons back, it would have to, our imaginations would have to be blown. And the characters would definitely also have to level up as well. Like all of the typical dad and typical kid and the mom and the sister, sure, keep that family, but, bring them more into the modern space, I think. Literally.
No, absolutely.
It would definitely work because, some franchises, have been brought back to life by the right creator or the right visionary, so it's not impossible. But, a lot of that has to be worked out at Warner Discovery, and they're doing a lot of working out right now.
Oh, are they ever?
Mike, what do you think? Is there room? Do you want to see any more Jetsons, new properties?
Like everyone's been saying, it has to be done the right way. I don't want just to see something thrown together or some. There had been over the last 20 years some really bad versions of Scooby-Doo done. some really bad ones.
Mhm.
But I loved the last movie that they did. The Scoob movie was amazing. And I
Yes.
was looking forward to the second one before Warner canceled it. And because they were starting to universe build with this
Yes, they
and
were.
everything. And there was a lot of possibilities. I could see them doing something like that with the Jetsons. And, even tie it in, if they wanted to get away from a little bit of humor, even tie it into some of like Space Ghost, even, or something like that. Maybe, just tie it into, the whole outer space thing and everything. But I don't want it to see them fitting into tropes where, it becomes really stupid to watch, and it has to be a good story. It would have to be something that would be intelligent and just not, everyone playing their role and, oh, look who else is here. It's Mr. Spacely. Ha 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 ha. Ha. It's, UNIVAC. Ha ha ha. And, I don't want to see that. I want to see something that would be an interesting story and maybe take it, another 100 years in the future. Because, I've read, back in 1962 when they said it was going to be 100 years in the future and everything. We're only 40 years away from that now, folks. And, like you've been saying throughout the episode, Mike, we do have a lot of the technologies that they were talking about on this show at the time. But, I would love to see them, maybe push it another 100 years, another 200 years or something. Even, what they're talking about, when they were going to redo Space 1999, they were going to make it Space 2099 or something, to push it another 100 years. So it's not in our past or upcoming future or something like that. Because, I would love to see it be wondrous and everything. And as a kid, the Jetsons was wondrous. It was like, oh, look at all these cool things that they could do or they can go to, floating around in tubes or floating, watching pictures on TV of talking to somebody, and it was awesome. But, I want to see that. I want them to capture the magic. And I'm worried that they wouldn't if they brought it back now. That's the problem. It would have to be with somebody really creative.
Right. Well, and look, when I ask like, hey, do you guys want to see more of this? I'm not asking, do you want to see like crap? I want to see like, I'm like saying, do you think that this property has any legs that somebody with, some creativity could bring with it? Look, if they do, if they do a live action version, especially, or even more animated, I agree with a lot of everything that you said. Obviously, there's a lot of things that would need to change in terms of updating the actual property, the characters and the premise and everything like that. But one thing that I would hope that they would keep and really just run with is, I know if it's going to be 100 years, 10 years, whatever it's going to be in the future, like, I hope it keeps that same sort of like space age, Southern California, modern architecture aesthetic. What do they call it? Googie architecture. Like, it's just got this like really cool, like slickness to it that just, to me, looks really cool aesthetically. And I think that would put it in its own sort of world, its own universe. So you wouldn't have to say like, how realistic is it or anything like that. It would just be so cool visually to watch. I think something like that would be really cool and different, because I don't think we'd have anything like that right now. So that would be a really kind of cool take on it. That would be but you could have so much fun telling all these like satirical stories of like other science fiction things that have come along now and like in the last like 50, 60 years that the Jetsons has been on. So you could have a lot of fun with it, I think. So I don't think it's a dead property. I think it's one that has been mishandled a bit, and started off kind of rough, because obviously it wasn't like, it lasted one season, and not to say that it wasn't successful, but it lasted one season, right? So and more weren't made until 20 years later. So it's not like it was like right on the cusp of everybody wanting to see this, but I think it could be fun to play around in this world. So I hope we see it at some point. So before we go, as we close, I want each one of you to tell me what that you should like. What's a favorite Jetsons episode or movie or whatever, what's something with the Jetsons that you think everybody needs to check out? We'll start with you, Mark McRae.
All right. Like I said earlier, I think the Jet Screamer episode is just standout. Just the animation, and it's sort of like a mini video in a sense, but it's just so much fun and has so much energy, and you can tell the animators were having a great time putting that episode together. And I feel like the Jet Screamer episode is the episode that sort of won me over as a viewer for the Jetsons, because I'm like, wow, they're having this much fun, I need to keep watching. So I would say the Jet Screamer episode, which I don't know how that falls. I know it's one of the early ones, but gotcha. That would be the one that I would definitely recommend if you want to watch the Jetsons, for sure.
Mark Heffernan?
Well, I will say probably my favorite episode is the one where they introduce Astro, and he's having a contest with the robot dog to decide which one they're going to keep. It's a lot of fun. Of course, what ends up happening is a burglar breaks in, and the burglar puts the mask on George, and of course the robot dog attacks George.
Of course.
And bites him in the butt. And so eventually, of course, they decide to keep Astro rather than the robot dog, but it's just got some funny slapstick moments to it. So that would be mine. So there you go.
Yeah. Mike, any picks?
Well, of course, for me, it's the first one that I had ever seen, which was G.I. Jetson. And I think that was episode 19 of the first season. And for me, it just holds a special place because it was the first episode. And I thought that UNIVAC was the big bad throughout the whole series, watching that and everything. And it was just a ton of fun. And, it's interesting how, what it was saying about society at the time, about the draft, about, people going out to, some people were volunteering at the time for the draft to get away from their jobs and such. And, this was all before Vietnam. So, it was a little more of a happy-go-lucky time for the military at that point. But it was very interesting to see, and it was just a fun story, and I definitely recommend that one. For me, it was my intro episode, and it could be something. Most of the first season, none of the stories connect, so you can put any of those stories in to introduce somebody to with the Jetsons.
Awesome. I gotta say, for me, as much as the show, is really what it's all about, I do have to have a somewhat soft spot in my heart for this comic series that DC put out called The Flintstones and the Jetsons. It was like alternating stories. They weren't together all the time, but it was just, they shared this title that ran for 12 issues. I don't know if you can get all of them in trade, if all 12 have been trade. I know that the first 6 were in a trade form, but they have some great covers, and they had some great artists and writers behind it. Nothing like too severe, nothing like too like amazing, but as far as alternative takes on these characters, like what would happen later with DC. But just some fun stuff written by guys like Mike Carlin, Bill Ray, Glenn Hansen worked on this as well, and like a lot of talented people. So I would check that out, because if you're a Flintstones and a Jetsons fan, it's 2 for 1, right? So all right, well, that concludes our discussion, I think. Thanks, guys, for celebrating 60 years of the Jetsons, and who knows, maybe more to come. So we will take a quick break while we get creative, and then be back to close out the show.
Boom.